He had survived gunfire, explosions, and ambushes, things most people wouldn't live through once. But it wasn't a bullet that almost killed Sergeant James. It was something silent, something sudden, and the only thing that saved him wasn't a medic, wasn't a fellow soldier. It was a dog. Sergeant James had seen it all: combat zones, late-night raids, missions that turned into nightmares. He was tough, trained, and trusted. But what happened one afternoon on a routine patrol nearly ended everything. What saved him wasn't luck or coincidence. It was Max, his canine partner, a German shepherd with more heart and courage than most humans. This is a story about loyalty, instinct, and a miracle that no one saw coming. In the world of military service, people often think the hardest part is the enemy in front of you. The firefights, the missions into the unknown, the bullets, the bombs, the ever-present threat of not coming home. But sometimes, the real challenge comes from within, when your own body becomes the battlefield. Sergeant James had served for over a decade. He wasn't new to danger. In fact, he'd gotten used to it. He'd survived missions that broke other men, walked away from ambushes that turned into chaos, and carried the weight of fallen friends on his back and in his heart. He wasn't reckless, but he was fearless. And more than anything, he was dependable. He wasn't a man who asked for help. He was the man people came to when things went sideways. When he was first paired with Max, a powerful, dark-coated German shepherd, he wasn't exactly thrilled. He respected canine units, of course, but he didn't see himself as a dog guy. He was a soldier, practical, focused, and to him, dogs were unpredictable. Loyal, sure, but not always reliable under pressure. That's what he believed anyway. Max, on the other hand, was a whole different kind of force. At first glance, Max looked every bit the perfect military dog. Strong build, intelligent eyes, precise movements. But the moment James tried to issue commands, Max responded like he was half listening. He didn't misbehave exactly. He just didn't bond. He obeyed, but without emotion. No wagging tail, no excitement, just action, cold and precise. James was used to men who respected the chain of command, who followed orders, who formed a kind of brotherhood through the dirt, the blood, and the long nights. But Max, he was something else, almost robotic, like he'd built a wall between himself and the world. Still, James wasn't one to give up. He believed in training, in repetition, in showing up until things clicked. So, day after day, he worked with Max drills, commands, obstacle courses, patrol simulations. At first, there was no change. Then came their first mission together. It was supposed to be simple, a routine sweep through a small rural area, just past a conflict zone. Intelligence suggested there might be hidden IEDs, improvised explosive devices. Nothing confirmed, but the area was risky enough that a K-9 unit was considered necessary. They landed by helicopter at dawn. The terrain was rough, dusty, dry, covered with patches of brush and broken roads. As they moved through the village outskirts, James kept his eyes on the usual trouble spots, doorways, roadside debris, anything out of place. Max stayed a few steps ahead, his nose twitching constantly, and then, without warning, he froze. James stopped. Max didn't bark, he didn't growl, he didn't make a sound. He simply turned his head, stared at a pile of broken bricks ahead, and took one cautious step back. That's all it took. James motioned to the rest of the unit to halt. They swept the area. Sure enough, beneath the pile was a pressure-sensitive explosive device, wired to go off with the next step. That moment changed everything. James didn't say much. He wasn't one for words, but something inside him shifted. That wasn't just a dog up there. That was a soldier. And not just any soldier, but one with instincts. One who saw what human eyes couldn't. From that day forward, their dynamic evolved. Max wasn't just a tool. He was a partner. At night, Max started curling up closer to James's bedroll. He stopped being distant. He began responding to James's voice with a soft tail wag or a quiet nudge. He wouldn't eat unless James gave the okay. He followed without hesitation, not because he was told to, but because he wanted to. There was no dramatic moment where they suddenly clicked. No grand scene like in the movies. Just time and quiet trust. Wordless understanding. And when missions became harder, when the terrain became unfamiliar, the risks more dangerous, Max never hesitated. He was always first to move, first to detect, first to protect. James had earned his respect, but then came the quiet enemy. It started small, a tightness in James's chest during a training run, just for a second or two, enough to make him slow down. Nothing sharp, nothing dramatic, just a sensation, like something was pressing on his lungs. He brushed it off. Maybe he was dehydrated. Maybe the heat was getting to him. Maybe he hadn't slept well the night before. In the military, you don't report every ache. You suck it up and move. But the tightness didn't go away. Over the next few days, it returned. Sometimes after a climb, sometimes while carrying gear. It would come and go, never lasting long enough to alarm anyone else. And James didn't say a word, because leaders don't show weakness. Not in front of the younger guys, not in front of the rookies, still trying to prove themselves. And definitely not in front of a dog who looked up to him like he hung the moon. But Max was no fool. He started acting strange. He began sniffing James's chest repeatedly, nudging his arm with more force than usual. He paced more at night, whined quietly in the dark. It wasn't loud enough to wake the others, but James heard it. Max had always been calm, alert, but never anxious. Now, he was restless, uneasy. James tried to ignore it, chalked it up to tension from the recent missions. Max must have been picking up on something. Maybe the stress, the atmosphere, the changes in routine. But deep down, something gnawed at him, because this wasn't a battlefield anymore. It wasn't a sniper or a roadside trap. This time, the enemy was invisible, and James didn't even realize he was already under attack. The days pressed on. Missions didn't stop just because something felt off. James wasn't the kind of man to pull himself from duty over a nagging feeling in his chest. In his mind, discomfort was part of the job. Pain, expected. You carry it like your pack and push forward. But Max's behavior only got more intense. It was no longer just a nose to the chest or a quiet whine in the night. Max began standing closer than usual, never letting James drift far. If someone approached too fast, even a fellow soldier, Max would step between them and James for a split second, like he was shielding him from something unseen. James noticed. Everyone noticed. "What's up with Max lately?" Someone joked one evening while they rested by the vehicles, dust clinging to every surface. "He thinks you're fragile now, or something, Sarge?" James gave a short chuckle and shrugged. Yes, he's getting soft. But the truth gnawed at him harder than he admitted. That night, long after the others had fallen asleep under the canvas-covered trucks and the humming stars above, James lay awake, eyes on the black sky. Max lay beside him, but unlike usual, he didn't curl up. He sat upright, watching him, guarding him. James felt it again. That pressure, a slow tightening behind the sternum, as if someone had wrapped a band around his chest and started pulling. He rubbed at it and closed his eyes. It would pass. It always did. But this time it didn't. He shifted on his cot, sweat starting to collect at his temples, despite the cool desert breeze. Max let out a low growl, not at anything outside, but at the air itself, like he knew something was happening, something wrong. James sat up, breathing slowly through his nose. It wasn't panic. He'd been through worse, but his heart was beating strangely, too slow, then suddenly too fast. He clenched his jaw and tried to stand. Max stood with him. "Easy, boy," James muttered, resting a hand on the dog's back. They stood there for a while, just a man and his dog in the shadows of military tents. Nothing else moved. Nothing else dared. By morning, the tightness had dulled, but it never really left. James felt off. He was quick to hide it, fast to play it down. That day's mission was routine. Another perimeter sweep, small recon, nothing too aggressive. But it took them far, almost 15 miles out into a network of hills and dry ravines. It was the kind of terrain where radios got patchy and backup didn't arrive fast, if at all. James had done this kind of thing 100 times, but today, he couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest, or the way Max wouldn't stop watching him. Like every move James made was being monitored, studied. They moved through the dusty paths, side by side. Max's ears flicked constantly, alert. His pace was steady but cautious. James, meanwhile, felt his feet dragging more than usual. His body felt heavier. His breath didn't come as easily. Then it happened. He stepped forward, maybe just 2 feet ahead of Max, and suddenly everything inside his body screamed. A white-hot bolt of pain shot from his chest to his jaw, then down his left arm. It was like being hit with a battering ram from the inside out. His knees buckled, his fingers clenched involuntarily. The world tilted. Max lunged forward instantly. James collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, one hand clawing at the dirt, the other clutching at his chest. The sun above him became a blur. His pulse throbbed in his ears. His vision swam. And Max wasn't barking. He wasn't panicking. He was doing something else, something far more deliberate. He shoved his body against James's side, trying to prop him up. He began licking his face, whining, short, sharp sounds. Then he looked around, eyes scanning the horizon. There was no one else nearby. They'd been ordered to fan out, small units in each direction. It would take time, maybe too much time, for anyone to return. James could barely breathe. His mind screamed, "This is it. Not a bullet, not an enemy ambush. A heart attack. In the middle of nowhere." Max didn't hesitate. He took off, running in the direction of the last patrol point, leaving James on the ground, barely conscious. It was against everything he'd been trained to do. Dogs don't abandon their handlers. They don't run unless commanded. But Max had seen something in James. Something serious, something final, and instincts had taken over. Max ran. His paws pounded the sand like gunfire, kicking up tiny clouds of dust as he weaved through the arid terrain. He didn't stop, didn't slow. His ears pinned back, his eyes locked forward. Every step had purpose. Every second mattered. He wasn't just looking for help. He was running to save James. Back at the makeshift base, little more than camo nets stretched between armored vehicles. A few soldiers were preparing for their midday recon check-in. It was quiet, the kind of silence that usually preceded tension. And then, out of nowhere, came Max. One of the soldiers stood, rifle in hand, surprised. "Hey, what's he doing here?" Max didn't bark, didn't jump or bite or beg for food. He ran straight to the nearest soldier, grabbed at the man's sleeve with his teeth, just enough to pull without harming, and then sprinted a few feet back toward the hills. Then he stopped, turned, waited. What the hell? Another soldier, a young corporal named Mendez, narrowed his eyes. "Wait, where's Sergeant James?" That did it. They grabbed their radios, but the signal was trash in that sector. Static, garbled echoes. Max let out a sharp, urgent bark, then ran a few more feet, turned again, barked twice more, eyes burning with insistence. That's when Mendez made the call. "Something's wrong. Look at him. He's not acting right. He wants us to follow." And they did. Two soldiers packed up water. One slung a first aid kit over his shoulder, and they started moving fast, half jogging, half sprinting, with Max leading the way. Back in the hills, James lay half conscious, his breaths coming in shallow, uneven bursts. He was barely aware of the sun beating down or the grit that clung to his skin. Pain shot through his chest like it was trying to carve him from the inside. He'd seen men die in battle, seen the life slip from their eyes in seconds. He never thought this would be how he'd go. Alone, no enemies, no gunfire, just his heart giving up. But in the haze of it all, he remembered Max running, disappearing into the distance. "Good boy," he murmured, though he wasn't sure the words made it out of his mouth. Time stretched. It felt like hours. Maybe it was only minutes. And then, footsteps. Fast, heavy. "Sergeant." Voices. Hands on his shoulders. The sound of a water canteen opening. A needle jabbed into his thigh. Something to stabilize him. Someone calling for medevac. Radio starting to crackle again, now that they were closer to high ground. And Max was there, panting, his sides heaving, tongue out, but eyes never leaving James's face. Even as the medics arrived, rotor blades thumping the air as the chopper kicked up a sandstorm, Max stood beside the stretcher, watching, waiting. James was lifted into the helicopter, oxygen mask over his face, vitals being monitored closely. His heart was still unstable. The medics didn't say much, but their eyes said everything. He was lucky, really lucky, but luck didn't explain it. Max did. The helicopter ride was bumpy. Desert winds always made it worse, but James didn't register much of it. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes catching the rhythmic beep of the monitor beside him, sometimes hearing voices, faint, rushed, concerned. Somewhere in the distance, a medic was shouting over the roar of the blades. His pulse is irregular. Keep him stable. But every time he came to, James searched one place, the floor beside him. Max. The medics didn't understand. The dog hadn't been allowed in the chopper. Regulations. But Max hadn't moved from the spot where the bird took off. His ears had followed the sound until the word became a whisper in the clouds. Then he sat, tail curled around his legs. He waited. Hours maybe. Sun high above. Dust whipping past him. He didn't care, because he didn't leave James. Back at base, it took effort to bring him into a temporary kennel, just until more orders came through. But Max didn't rest. He barely touched the food or water. He stared out the mesh door, unmoving, eyes locked on the horizon, as if willing the helicopter to return, to bring his human back. Meanwhile, James was rushed into surgery at a field hospital on the edge of the green zone. They stabilized him just in time, barely. A major artery had been blocked. The cardiologist told the attending nurse, if he'd arrived 15 minutes later, we'd be calling in the priest. But they didn't, because a dog had run for help. When James woke up, hooked up to machines, barely able to speak through the oxygen, the first word he uttered wasn't where or what. It was Max. The nurse beside him smiled softly. "He's safe. You're safe. That dog of yours saved your life." A tear formed at the corner of his eye, not from the pain, not even from fear, but from something deeper, because for all the drills, all the training, all the talk about loyalty and discipline, nothing compared to what Max had done. He hadn't just alerted someone. He had known that something was wrong, that his handler, his friend, was fading, and he'd done the impossible. Max wasn't a machine. He wasn't wired to understand cardiac events, but he sensed it, acted, decided, and because of that instinct, James was still breathing. 2 days later, they were reunited, still groggy from the surgery. James sat upright in his hospital cot, for in his arm, heart still weak, but beating steady, and through the flap of the tent came that familiar shape, 4 legs, ears perked, eyes glowing. Max, he didn't bark, didn't whine. He just walked straight to James, rested his head in the sergeant's lap, and let out a slow, steady sigh, as if to say, "You're okay now. I've got you." James ran a trembling hand through his fur. "You didn't leave me, not even for a second." He thought he'd seen the worst of war, but nothing had terrified him like the idea of dying alone in that desert, and nothing had given him more hope than the sound of Paws hitting the ground, racing against death. Alone, but not forgotten, the sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail where Sergeant James lay sprawled, his breath shallow, his body trembling from the shock of his heart shutting down mid-step. His gear was heavy on his chest, making the pain worse, but he couldn't remove it, couldn't move, could barely think. Everything felt muffled, like the world had been wrapped in cotton. The pounding in his ears was deafening, louder than gunfire, louder than the war zone he'd survived for years. But he wasn't alone. Max was there. At first, the German shepherd barked, loud, sharp barks that echoed through the empty wilderness. He ran in frantic circles around James, nudging him with his nose, licking his face, pawing at his vest. His training kicked in immediately. He wasn't just a dog, he was a soldier too. But this was different from anything he'd ever been prepared for. Max had been trained to sniff out explosives, detect hidden enemies, guard his handler with his life. But this, watching James fall with no external threat in sight, it confused him, alarmed him. He paced, whined, barked again. Still, James didn't move. Something deep inside Max stirred, something beyond training, an instinct, a bond. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't some battlefield tactic. His human was in trouble, dying. Max's ears twitched. His body went tense. He scanned the terrain with razor-sharp focus, checking for danger, then returned his full attention to James. The man groaned softly, his lips barely moving. Radio. The whisper was so faint, Max almost didn't hear it. But he knew. Max had been around radios enough. He knew that when James spoke into that black box on his chest, help came, orders were given, life moved. Now the box was silent. Max did what no one expected. He used his teeth, gently, carefully, to tug at the cord attached to James's shoulder mic. It didn't activate. The unit was damaged in the fall. Max tried again, his movements desperate. Nothing. And that's when something clicked. If the radio was dead, he'd have to go find help. Max stood over James for a moment, hesitant. Leaving wasn't easy, not even for a trained K9. His job was to guard, protect, stay. But the situation had shifted. His instincts wrestled with his loyalty. Stay and watch James die, or leave and maybe, just maybe, bring back help in time. Max looked into James's face, saw the pain, the struggle, the flicker of fear in the eyes of the man who'd never shown fear before. That decided it. Max bolted. Max ran like the wind. Every paw hit the ground with a force fueled not just by training, but by desperation. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he had to move, had to get to someone, anyone. The last known checkpoint was over 2 miles away, miles of rugged, dry land, littered with sharp rocks, thorny brush, and hidden dangers. But Max didn't hesitate. He leapt over cracks in the terrain, darted past snake holes and broken branches. Dust flew up behind him like a wake. His chest heaved, but he didn't slow down. Not for a second. He remembered the route. It wasn't straight, but he remembered the markers. A twisted tree with a scar down its middle, a shattered radio tower long abandoned, a rusted-out truck frame from a war no one even remembered anymore. To a human, the path might have been a maze. To Max, it was burned into his memory. Minutes passed, then more, but time didn't feel linear. It felt like it was closing in on him, tightening like a noose. Every second away from James was a second closer to disaster, to death, and yet he kept running. Back at the forward operating base, Corporal Dana Morales was finishing a routine check-in when she heard it. At first, It sounded like a coyote, sharp, distant howls carried by the wind. But something about it made her pause. She stepped outside the comms tent, squinting into the hazy afternoon sun. Then, through the heat shimmer, she saw a blur, a dog, sprinting, hard. Her heart skipped. "Is that Max?" She ran toward the figure. Just as others followed, one of the techs raised his binoculars and confirmed it. "Yeah, that's Max. Where's James?" Dana's blood went cold. The dog wasn't supposed to be alone, ever. And he wasn't just running. He was frantic, wild-eyed, tail stiff and unmoving. He skidded into the camp, panting, paws bleeding, and immediately ran up to Dana, circling, barking, darting toward the edge of the base, then back toward her, over and over. He was trying to tell them something. Dana grabbed her gear, already barking orders. "Get the med team. Get a transport ready. Max doesn't come back without James unless something's gone wrong." Max turned, took 3 steps toward the wilderness, then looked back, waiting. He wasn't just asking them to follow. He was leading them. Dana didn't waste a second. She'd seen Max in action before. He was a living, breathing force. His instincts were sharp, and when he was on a mission, there was no stopping him. But this time, the stakes were different. The dog wasn't just searching for an enemy. He was searching for his handler, the one person who mattered most to him. "Move out, now!" Dana shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos of scrambling soldiers. The team gathered their gear as quickly as they could. But even though they were trained for speed and precision, there was no way they could keep up with Max. Not in terrain like this. Not with him being so far ahead. Max had already disappeared back into the wilderness, moving like a shadow. As Dana and her team prepared to follow, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling in her stomach. Something was wrong. She'd been in countless situations, always confident she could handle whatever came next. But the way Max was acting, the urgency in his movements, it told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't a routine mission. This was a life-or-death situation. Max, meanwhile, hadn't slowed down. He knew time was against him, and the searing heat of the desert felt like it was closing in on him. But there was nothing more he could do. His breath came in sharp, quick gasps as he pushed forward. His body was aching from the exertion, but he couldn't afford to stop. He had to find help. The world around him blurred. The path was becoming increasingly harder to follow as the dust swirled, making the once familiar landmarks harder to spot. The ground was littered with jagged rocks, thorny shrubs, and the occasional poisonous snake slithering across the dirt. But Max navigated through it with ease, his eyes locked on a singular mission. James. The pain in Max's chest was growing. He could feel his heart racing, his paws cracking against the dry earth. His mind, sharp as ever, screamed for him to stop, to pause and gather himself. But then, he would look over his shoulder, and the sight of James' lifeless body flashing in his mind would spur him forward again. He had to save him. Back at the base, Dana's team finally caught up with Max. Their hearts pounded, matching the dog's frenetic energy. They were all moving, but they knew they weren't moving fast enough. The environment was a harsh opponent, and every minute they spent behind Max was another minute they could lose. As they finally reached Max's last known location, Dana looked down at the ground, scanning for any sign of where James had fallen. There, barely visible beneath a patch of dry grass, was a patch of darkened dirt, blood. Her pulse quickened. "Where is he?" Dana barked, her eyes scanning the horizon. Max was already off again, barreling through the brush without a second thought. There was no time to waste. If they didn't catch up soon, it would be too late. Max, now feeling the ache in his muscles, pushed forward. His paws burned with every step, but he wouldn't stop. His training as a military dog had prepared him for war. But this was personal. This wasn't about orders. This was about his partner, the man who had been with him every day, the man who trusted him with his life. Max's determination was unmatched. Nothing could stand in his way. Then, just as he crested a small ridge, he spotted something. A figure. It was James, but he was barely conscious, lying on the ground, his chest heaving. His face was pale, his eyes clouded with pain. Max's heart raced. He was almost there. Max's nose twitched as he picked up the scent of James. It was faint, carried on the hot desert wind, but it was enough. Max's body surged forward, his pace faster than ever before. His instincts were kicking in full force now, and everything else, the heat, the pain, the fatigue, faded into the background. There was only one thing on his mind, James. The scent grew stronger with every step. Max's eyes narrowed, focusing on the figure lying ahead. James wasn't moving, his body stretched out on the sand like a rag doll tossed carelessly aside. His face was twisted in pain, sweat dripping down his brow. His chest rose and fell erratically, each breath sounding more desperate than the last. Max's heart sank. He slowed down as he neared, dropping his head to the ground, sniffing at James's face. His tail, which had been rigid and poised for action, dropped to the sand as if it too knew the gravity of the situation. His paws gently brushed against James's body, nudging him, but James didn't respond. A low, frantic whine escaped Max's throat. "James," Max's eyes seemed to say. "Come on, please." But nothing. James's condition was worsening. The blood pressure in his body was likely crashing, his pulse faint and erratic. The heart attack had taken everything out of him, and the worst part was that he was alone. Max's mind raced. He had no medical training, no understanding of human biology. All he knew was that his handler was in trouble. But what could he do? What could a dog possibly do to save a human life? The answer came to him in an instant. Max had always been trained for moments like these, trained to think on his feet, to follow orders, to protect, but above all, he had been trained to never leave his partner behind, and that was exactly what he would do. Max's paw brushed against James's arm once more. He could feel the warmth of James's skin against his fur. His eyes scanned the area for anything that might help, but there was nothing. No medic kit, no backup, just the heat of the desert and the sand beneath their feet. Max had only one option left. He had to get help. It wasn't easy. The moment Max decided to leave James's side and run for help, a part of him hesitated. He'd never left James before, not in any situation. But this was different. This wasn't just a mission. This was a life and death struggle. Max's body, already exhausted from the relentless chase to find James, fought against him. But he pushed forward. His muscles burned, and his mind screamed in protest. But Max didn't stop. He ran. The distance was like an endless stretch of desert, but Max's legs never faltered. The determination to save James pushed him forward, step after step, until he could feel his body beginning to give out. His breath came in desperate gasps, but he never slowed. His paws pounded against the hard, unforgiving terrain, propelling him toward the nearest outpost. He knew he wasn't fast enough. Max's thoughts were clouded by the urgency of the situation. Every moment he wasted was another moment closer to losing James, but he refused to give in to despair. He had to believe that he could make it in time. Back at the base, Dana and her team were rapidly closing the gap, but they were still a distance away from Max's location. The terrain was too rough, the heat too harsh, the silence of the desert felt suffocating, and every minute they spent chasing Max was a reminder that James was still lying out there, alone and vulnerable. "Move faster," Dana barked, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and frustration. The team pushed on, but even they knew there was no guarantee they would get there in time. The reality was sinking in. Max was their best hope, and he wasn't slowing down. Max, running with every last ounce of strength in his body, finally saw a glimmer of hope in the distance. A figure, human figures, emerged from the haze of dust, their forms coming into clearer view with each passing second. The faintest sound of a vehicle reached his ears. He didn't stop. He couldn't. But the realization that he was close, so close, began to seep into him. He barked, his voice a sharp, urgent command to anyone who would listen. The sound echoed through the empty desert. Max's heart raced as he reached the outpost, his paws digging into the dirt. His body was trembling with exhaustion, but there was still one thing on his mind. "James," he whined again, louder this time. He didn't know how to explain what had happened, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. He darted to the side of the vehicle, standing still for just a moment to catch his breath, before looking back in the direction he'd come from. Dana, along with the rest of the team, caught up to Max in a flash. She took one look at the dog's exhausted face and instantly knew what had happened. "Where is he?" Dana demanded, her voice hard and firm, but full of worry. Without hesitation, Max turned and began sprinting back into the desert, a clear signal to follow. Dana wasted no time. She motioned for the team to follow suit. "We're not losing him," she said through gritted teeth. "Not today." Max's journey back felt like it took forever, the weight of the task ahead of him pressing down on his shoulders. But then, there it was again, the familiar scent, the faint sound of a heartbeat, barely detectable, but enough to drive him forward. James was still alive. As Max and the rescue team made their way back to where James had collapsed, the air around them seemed to thicken with tension. Every step Max took felt like a small victory, a reminder that time, though fleeting, had not yet run out. The dog's determination never wavered, his eyes locked on the horizon, where James's lifeless form still lay, untouched by the harsh desert winds. Dana's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Max's lead. Her mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, each one darker than the last. Was James even still alive? Was there enough time? The doubt threatened to swallow her whole, but she held it together. The team moved swiftly, their boots kicking up the dust as they pushed forward. Max stopped just short of the spot where James lay, his body now barely visible against the sand, the heat radiating off of it in waves. The dog's tail remained low, a sign of the exhaustion and desperation coursing through his veins. His body was shaking, but his eyes never left James. He moved cautiously toward the fallen soldier, still hopeful, still resolute. Dana caught up, out of breath, and knelt next to James, pulling her medical pack from her belt. Her hands trembled as she checked for a pulse, her heart sinking when she couldn't find one. The reality of the situation hit her like a freight train. It was too late. They were too late. But Max wouldn't accept that. The German shepherd, despite his own fatigue, moved closer to James, lowering his head to nudge his partner again. His body shook from exhaustion, but he wouldn't leave. The bond they shared, an unspoken connection forged through countless trials, hardships, and moments of trust, drove Max to do what no one else could. Max let out a soft whimper, his eyes searching James's face for any sign of life. It was then that something amazing happened. James's chest rose, a slow, labored breath, but it was enough. Dana looked up, disbelief and relief flooding her. He's still breathing, just barely. Max whined, then turned to look at Dana, as if asking, begging for help. There was no hesitation in his movements now. His instincts had kicked in long before the team had arrived. He knew what needed to be done, and he wasn't going to let James slip away without a fight. Dana quickly began administering CPR, her hands pressing against James's chest, while Max watched with an intensity that could only come from a deep, undeniable bond. His ears were alert, his body stiff, his eyes never leaving the scene unfolding before him. As Dana worked tirelessly, Max's body trembled, the strain of the journey finally catching up to him. But he didn't flinch. He stayed right by James's side, just as he had been trained to do, just as he had promised. Minutes felt like hours as Dana continued her efforts, working through sheer willpower, refusing to give up. The seconds stretched out, every passing one a reminder of how fragile life was in the harsh conditions of the desert. But Max remained a constant presence, standing guard over James, his faithful companion. Suddenly, James coughed, a violent, ragged sound that echoed through the silence of the desert. His eyes fluttered open, dazed, disoriented. It was the moment Max had been waiting for. The sergeant's hand shot out, grabbing Max's fur weakly, as if to say thank you. But the words didn't come. There was nothing to say, really. No words could explain the depth of gratitude, the miracle that had just occurred. Max let out a low, relieved growl, his body relaxing just slightly. The tension in his muscles eased as he realized that his partner was going to be okay. Dana sat back, exhausted but relieved. She could hardly believe it. Against all odds, James had survived, and Max had saved him. But this wasn't the end of the story. As James slowly regained consciousness, Max's dedication to his partner never wavered. The dog stayed close, never leaving his side, even as the rescue team worked to stabilize the sergeant. James, though still weak, managed to look up at Max, a quiet appreciation in his eyes. "You did it, boy," James whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. Max's ears perked up at the sound of his handler's voice. The dog wagged his tail just once, and it was enough. In that simple, understated gesture, Max showed more love, loyalty, and gratitude than words could ever express. The journey back to safety was long and arduous, but James wasn't alone. Max remained by his side, guiding him every step of the way. Together, they crossed the harsh terrain, both fighting against the elements, but always moving forward. When they finally reached base, James was immediately rushed to medical care, and Max was given a much-needed rest. The soldiers who had heard the story were in awe of the dog's heroism. They had witnessed firsthand the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his K9 partner, and they knew that without Max, James wouldn't have made it. It wasn't just about survival, it was about the strength of their connection. Max had saved James not because he was a trained military dog, but because he was loyal. He loved James in a way that transcended words, transcended training. In that moment, Max proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the battlefield is the love between a man and his dog. As James was wheeled into the military hospital, his mind began to fog. The adrenaline had started to wear off, and fatigue crept in. He could still feel the weight of Max's presence beside him, the dog's loyal eyes watching him closely, as if making sure he didn't slip away again. Every step of the journey back, Max had never strayed too far. The bond they shared was something that couldn't be broken, not even by the harshest of circumstances. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, the medics worked quickly to stabilize James. The doctors moved with precision, their hands swift but careful as they hooked him up to machines and monitors. Dana was at his side, her face still pale from the exertion of the rescue, but her expression soft as she watched over her friend, her comrade. But what stuck with her most was the image of Max, standing just outside the room, watching through the glass, as if keeping guard. The dog's presence was a silent promise that James was not alone. "He's going to be okay," Dana whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But even though the words were meant for comfort, she knew the reality. James was a soldier, a fighter, and fighters didn't give up easily. Max stood still, ears alert, eyes locked on James. Even though the medical team had done their part, it was clear to everyone present that Max was still on guard. He wasn't leaving, not until his partner was safe, not until his job was done. A few hours passed before James finally opened his eyes again, the blur of the hospital room slowly coming into focus. He felt weak, his chest still heavy, but the pain had subsided. He could hear the faint beep of machines, the low murmur of voices, but one thing stood out to him more than anything else: the steady sound of Max's breathing just outside the room. He could feel the dog's presence, even though he couldn't see him yet. Max had kept vigil. When James' eyes finally adjusted to the dim light, he turned his head slightly and saw the familiar figure of Max lying just beyond the doorway. The dog was curled up in a ball, his eyes half closed, but still watchful, still alert. He hadn't moved an inch since they arrived. The sight of Max brought a flood of emotions. James felt a lump rise in his throat as he fought back the tears that had threatened to spill over. The relief was overwhelming. He knew that without Max, he wouldn't be lying here, still alive. He wouldn't have made it back from the brink. "Max," James whispered, his voice hoarse. The moment he spoke, Max's ears perked up, the dog's head lifted, and those intense, loyal eyes locked onto James's. A split second later, Max stood, his movement slow but deliberate as he padded toward the bed. It was almost as though the dog understood that his job wasn't finished until he was by James's side. He approached cautiously, but with a quiet sense of urgency. James held out his hand, still weak, and Max responded immediately, moving closer and resting his head gently on James's hand. The contact was simple, but it spoke volumes. In that moment, the weight of everything, the danger, the rescue, the bond, came flooding back. Max had done more than just save his life. He had saved a part of James that might have been lost forever. "You're one hell of a dog," James muttered softly, his hand brushing through Max's fur. The dog's tail thumped gently against the floor in response, as if to say, "I'm just doing my job." But James knew better. This wasn't just a dog doing his job. This was a partner, one that had gone above and beyond in a way that no human ever could. Max stayed close, his head resting on the bed as James drifted in and out of consciousness. And when he woke again, the sight of Max still by his side was a constant reminder that he was not alone in this. He had a partner, someone who, without question, would do whatever it took to protect him. In the days that followed, James's recovery was nothing short of a miracle. He was slowly brought back to full health by the medical team, but he knew the real credit belonged to Max. The dog had saved his life, and now, it seemed, Max had made it his mission to see James back to his feet. Despite the gravity of his situation, James couldn't help but smile every time he saw Max sitting beside him, watching over him with unwavering dedication. Even as he recovered, the bond between them only deepened. Max never left James's side. The two of them were inseparable, and it was clear to everyone that they were more than just a handler and a dog. They were family. And so, after days of recovery, the time finally came for James to leave the hospital. As he was discharged, the team gathered around him, clapping him on the back, congratulating him on his survival. But James couldn't help but feel like he owed it all to Max. Without the dog, he wouldn't have made it through. "Where's Max?" James asked, looking around the room. At that moment, Max trotted into the room, his tail wagging as he spotted his partner. It was as if nothing had happened, like the whole ordeal had been just another day in the life of the two of them. James knelt down to Max's level, his hand shaking slightly as he reached out to touch the dog's fur. "You saved my life, buddy," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Max looked up at him, those loyal eyes speaking more than any words could. He was just doing his job. But to James, it was so much more than that. It was a testament to the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. The love, the loyalty, the trust, they were all there, woven into the very fabric of their partnership. Max stood by James as they walked out of the hospital, a hero in his own right. And as they stepped into the sunlight, the future no longer seemed so uncertain, because no matter what came next, James knew he wasn't facing it alone. He had Max, his partner, his friend, his miracle. As the days passed, James slowly regained his strength. The doctors told him he was lucky to have survived such a serious heart attack in the middle of a dangerous mission, with no medical help around. But James knew, deep down, that his survival wasn't just due to luck. It was because of Max. The bond they shared had been tested to its limits. Max had not only saved his life, but had also become James's anchor during those agonizing moments of uncertainty. The loyalty and bravery Max displayed weren't just qualities instilled by training. They were the deep, instinctive traits of a dog who saw his handler as more than just a commander. He saw him as family. Over the next few weeks, as James healed, he couldn't help but reflect on the miracle that had occurred. Max didn't just perform the role of a trained military dog that day. He acted out of love, instinct, and an unspoken understanding. It wasn't just a heroic act. It was a testament to the unique bond between a human and their dog, a bond that goes beyond commands, training, and duty. James knew he couldn't put into words what he owed to Max. Words would never be enough, but the silent way they understood each other, the way Max stayed by his side without ever leaving, spoke louder than any phrase or thank you ever could. Max became more than just a dog to James. He became a symbol of courage, a reminder of how sometimes the heroes aren't the ones we expect, but the ones who stay with us through every hardship, no matter what. In time, James and Max returned to their unit, but they were forever changed. The connection between them was stronger than ever. They went on to serve together for many more years, side by side, facing challenges that would have been unimaginable without each other. To this day, James tells the story of the day Max saved his life, a story of survival, of love, and of the incredible loyalty that exists between a man and his dog. But more than that, it's a reminder of the unbreakable bond that transcends everything, because in the end, it wasn't the military training that saved him, it was Max's heart. If you believe in the power of loyalty and the extraordinary bond between a dog and their owner, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to hear more incredible stories like this, make sure to check out our next video.